So next up is Philip VanMantgem, and he's a research ecologist also with the USGS, although he's stationed in Arcata. And his research interests include forest dynamics with an emphasis on climate change impacts, forest ecology, and management of forest ecosystems. He received his PhD in ecology from UC Davis, and he's been studying and enjoying forests in the western United States since 1995. So, Philip, look forward to hearing your presentation.
Okay, well, thank you. And I appreciate everybody hanging in during lunchtime. I know I'm looking forward to a sandwich already, but if we can hang in there for another half hour, I'll try to be interesting here. So the question is, let's see if I can advance the slide here. Given that we have a fairly intense drought here, it's been an interesting year to study forest mortality and the effects of the drought, and it's had a focusing effect, certainly on a lot of people. And last November, Governor Brown declared an emergency over dead trees in California. And as Jeff mentioned, we had 22 million trees that may have died during this 4-year drought, and tens of millions more expected to follow. So that's brought attention to a lot of the mortality factors that's gone on with the drought over the past couple of years. And I just wanted to flash this up here. This is a report, presumably, that Jeff was involved with, looking at the area of mortality just in the southern Sierra Nevadas, and that's where I'm going to focus because, again, this is where we've been seeing a lot of the drought impacts. So that particular survey looked at 3.5 million acres thereabout. They found an area of mortality with about 500,000 acres, and they estimated about 6 million trees died in that event. And again, just to reiterate what's been said already, it's mostly been occurring in the lower elevation in the Ponderosa Pine region, and it's also affected oak mortality as well. Another thing that just came out just within the last few weeks is Greg Asner, and Nate has mentioned some of his work earlier, especially and specifically with the surveying of foliage dieback in giant sequoias. He's also done larger surveys across California, and what he's found is that approximately 10.5 million hectares of forest have experienced drought stress as measured by remotely sensed imagery, and he's figuring about 888 million large trees have experienced measurable loss in canopy water content. So that's a fairly large area and a fairly large swath. So the question I have is what, if anything, can be done as managers? And we have a fairly limited toolbox of things that we can use, and primarily thinning, and whether that thinning is done with mechanical means, whether it's done with prescribed fire or some combination of the two, is really what we have open to us for sort of what we call adaptation strategies. And I want to focus on two aspects of adaptation: resistance, which is the ability to maintain essentially a system unchanged following a disturbance, and resilience, the ability of that system to recover quickly from a disturbance. And I'm sorry this doesn't look like it came through all very well. This is just a diagram of the decline spiral model of tree death. And if it came through better, what it would show is that you have a healthy tree, and there's usually not one factor that drives mortality. Usually it's in combination. I think what Adrian was showing was proximate causes of mortality, sort of the coup de grace of what kills off a tree. But usually those trees suffer from other stressors as well in concert with that thing that finally kills them off. And so if we were to have a healthy tree, eventually, if it was affected by competition, then perhaps it's more open to bark beetles attacking it, and then eventually it dies. We can look at that same idea graphed out just a little differently. So if we look at high vigor trees across time, what we see is that if we have a high vigor tree and it gets affected by a drought, and I'm see if I can find that pointer. And so if a drought occurs, that tree is more likely to be able to bounce back. It's more likely to be resilient to that stress. It also probably won't be affected quite as much by that drought. It will be more resistant. If we have a low vigor tree, say something that's affected by competition, and it experiences that same drought, it probably will be exposed to bark beetle attack, and the vigor will keep decreasing until the tree is actually dead. So this is just another way of looking at sort of at tree mortality and how we think it occurs across the landscape. And so what can we do with that information? This is a cartoon that Connie Millar with the Forest Service and Nate Stevenson, who just spoke earlier, put together, looking at how forest managers can respond to an era of mega disturbances, things like the drought that we've been experiencing. If that's more common in the future, what can be done? And one of the ideas is that if you look at a forest ecosystem service and you have a large disturbance over here, you might catastrophically lose a lot of that landscape. Eventually something will come back, but we've lost a lot of ecosystem services as a result of that disturbance. Conversely, if we do something more active, if we thin out these forests, or if we start encouraging other species to come in that might be more resistant to that disturbance, we'll lose some ecosystem services in the face of that sort of mega disturbance, but likely not as much, and that system will recover a little faster. And so if we look at resistance, that would be this area in the blue, where the forest that we've actively managed shows less loss of that ecosystem service, whatever that might be, if that's wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration. Or resilience, its ability to bounce back, so we have more of that ecosystem service left following the disturbance. So I want to look at mechanical thinning here. First of all, this is what it looks like. And in national parks, we're able to actually do mechanical thinning. So that's in at least some areas. Here's a shot of ponderosa pine forest in Lassen Volcanic National Park. Also in Redwood National Park, at least in the second growth forests, we have what looks like active logging operations, and that's a thinning operation that's done to encourage coast redwood regeneration. We can also do thinning using prescribed fire. And so here's a late season prescribed fire at Sequoia National Park, pre-fire on your left, and 1 year post-fire on your right. And we've thinned out a lot of trees like that. And so the question that we're asking is really, once we create a forest structure following active management like that, is it more resilient or resistant to a drought effect? And again, sort of reiterating what Nate and Adrian has just said, this drought over the last few years in California has given us an opportunity to learn from that. And we can go back to some of the areas that have been treated in the past and see if they've responded differently to drought. And what we've done is looked at long-term forest plot data, surveys up till 2014, so we don't have the last year of drought, so I think we're missing some information. And we're focusing here on the ponderosa pine mixed conifer forest, mostly in that mixed conifer forest, mostly Abies concolor or white fir. And we were able to find 38 unburned plots, or I'm sorry, 38 burned plots, and this is a large part of that is from Park Service fire effects monitoring plots that are sort of scattered across these national parks, and 18 unburned plots. And some of those are these fire effects plots that for some reason or another did not get burned, and also we're using some of the plot data that Adrian was just talking about. We looked at, for our burn plots, we only considered trees that, or stands that had burned at least more than 6 years post-fire, so we're not measuring fire effects directly, so we don't want to look at things that had been scorched heavily and then died. We wanted to look at things that had survived that fire. And for our sample size, we had about a little bit shy of 10,000 trees. And this is what we've been seeing where we have long-term measurements of forest mortality. Adrian was showing this for some of the plots earlier. This is a different way of graphing it out. And we have elevation along the x-axis here. Along the y-axis, we have a change in a long-term mortality rate. And what we're seeing is that a burn plot here in red had much lower mortality rate, at least in 2013, 2014, compared to its long-term average. And some of our unburned plots at low elevation had looked like less or a higher mortality rate than compared to its long-term average. And that effect, again, we have low sample sizes, but that seemed to sort of taper out, at least at higher elevations. So again, we're concentrating on low elevation forests for this study because we're trying to look at areas that had been impacted by the drought. And so what do these forest structures actually look like? In our burned areas, we have much lower stand densities. Not too surprising. We've removed a lot of the small trees by using fire. And the burn stands have much higher numbers of trees. If we look at basal area, we haven't affected things that much. So the fires have essentially removed a lot of small trees, left a lot of the large trees remaining. Again, this is sort of what we hope for these prescribed fire treatments. And what did we find? When we look at individual probabilities of tree mortality, and here we have stem diameter along the x-axis and along the y-axis, we have a modeled probability of death during 2013 and 2014, these drought years. And what we find is that the unburned trees that are in the unburned stands have a much higher probability of mortality. Trees in the burned stands have a much lower probability of mortality. And this varied whether it was a pine or some other genera, and that's mostly incense cedar and white fir for the other genera. But the effects were about the same. And I don't think we've nailed this down altogether. This is an encouraging result showing that perhaps if we use fire as a thinning treatment, we've decreased the probability of trees dying during a drought. But we haven't considered the effects of the 2015 drought, and we're certainly not looking at any of the mechanisms that are behind any of this. So what is the role of competition exactly? What are the roles of pathogen and insects? Likely there's going to be surprises. Again, this is sort of what Adrian was saying in the last talk. And also we need to start looking at other species, other regions. And as a note, there is a survey that was going back and looking at U.S. Forest Service timber surveys back in 1911 in the same region that we were taking our plot data from. And what they're finding is that the trees per hectare were about 72.7 in these sort of productive ponderosa pine stands. The basal area is about 21.5 meters per hectare back in 1911. In 2013, our post-fire plots still looked very different from that. So we had about 159 trees per hectare in our burned areas, and our basal area is about 74 meters per hectare. So large differences than presumably what the historic stand structure looked like. So what's next? What we'd like to do is increase the sample that we're considering this question at. So we'd like to survey tree mortality in burned and unburned areas across California, and we've been partnering with some people from the University of Arizona who are doing similar sorts of surveys in Arizona and New Mexico and Utah. And we'd also like to construct some mortality models in burned and unburned stands using tree rings, just to try to get a better idea of the mechanisms. Some of the potential sites that we're looking at are these FMH plots, which are Park Service fire effects plots, going back to some of these fire and fire surrogate sites, looking at the plot data that Adrian was just mentioning. Tea Kettle Experimental Forest is another likely site that we'll be drawing data from. And if someone in the audience has ideas for other places that would be likely useful for this survey, I'd be interested in hearing about that. So that's one of my goals for actually presenting this is I don't think we know about all the treatments that are out there in the landscape, and if people have ideas, I'd be very interested in hearing about it. In the Colorado Plateau, we'll probably be also visiting these FMH plots and looking at fire and fire surrogates plots. One of the things we'd also like to do is link remotely sensed imagery or hyperspectral data, that sort of thing, and that's its measurement of drought effects, looking at also some of these aerial mappings that Jeff was talking about, and seeing if if the effects of drought have varied at all by management treatment, again, across a larger area. And here we're working with people from the Forest Service, mostly looking at FIA data and some other data sources that we can pull together. And a lot of the image processing is being done with people in UC Davis. So that's a larger landscape sort of view. So that's adaptation for resistance. What about resilience? We don't have a whole lot of data on resilience yet. That seems to be less well studied, and certainly for the California drought, we don't have information yet. As people have been saying throughout this webinar, we don't know how these forests are going to recover yet because the effects of the droughts are still ongoing. There's some early suggestions that thinning treatments still might be effective for that. One example is in a ponderosa pine forest in northern New Mexico, where it had a history of grazing and logging. There were some thinning treatments that were done prior to a large drought in 2002, and those thinned areas had less of an, it still showed a sort of decrease in growth, but during that drought event, but they were able to bounce back a lot further, so they seemed to be more resilient to that drought. And a second area was thinned post-drought, and that also showed significant increases in basal area increment, or the growth of those residual trees following thinning. I don't think we know everything that we need to know. It's certainly sort of intuitively appealing that if you reduce competition, then those drought effects should be lessened. There's an interesting study that was out in 2013 where they're looking at red pine in Minnesota, and a series of thinning treatments that were done where they artificially kept basal area low in some stands, and they let it remain high in others. And in 1961, following the treatments, that they found exactly what you'd expect, is that those thinning effects, those areas that had low basal area, seemed to respond well to a drought. So they had high resistance and high resilience as measured by growth rates. They had another drought in 1988 where they found the exact opposite happened, where these residual trees in the highly thinned areas seemed to have very low resistance as measured by growth rates, and very low resilience as well. And they're speculating that's because the trees that were actually, the residual trees in those highly thinned areas were large, and they had acclimated to sort of benign conditions, and they had high leaf area, and then when a drought finally hit, they weren't able to respond as well. But that's just sort of speculation. And I think the take home here is that we just don't really know enough yet about how the system is going to respond. And finally, we can create landscapes that look nice, that are very open, that have removed a lot of fuels, and have a nice forest structure that looks like it should be resistant and resilient to drought. And here's an example from Ponderosa Pine Forest and Lava Beds National Monument. There are a lot of barriers to implementation, though, as you probably everyone in the audience realizes. So getting the funding for prescribed fire, finding the air quality windows are difficult. Site accessibility is an issue, especially with thinning treatments. Prescribed fire might not be sufficiently severe in a lot of areas to really affect forest stand structure, so we see these sorts of effects. And finally, hotter droughts, that's the sort of these climate change type scenarios that Nate was talking about, might produce stresses that exceed the potential for management responses. So those are big unknowns going forward. I'd also like to, if you're interested in this topic, we have a website pulled together about some of our ongoing projects where we sort of go into more detail about this. And finally, what does the future hold? It's a good question. The future is uncertain, but a couple, I think we have a few take-homes already. So the recent drought that we had in California, I think might be a good sneak peek of future conditions. Thinning treatments, whether it's mechanical, prescribed fire, or both, have the potential, at least, to increase forest resistance and resilience to drought. How that actually plays out will be interesting to find out. And finally, these thinning treatments might represent one of these magic no-regrets management options, where it's something we want to do anyway for other reasons, either if it's for fuels management or encourage particular forest structures. That might also make these stands more resistant and resilient to expected disturbances in the future, though we have a lot of barriers to implementation. And finally, I'd like to thank the people that were involved with this study, particularly all the people that were out there collecting data. So if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to take a fly at that.